And now we're going to move on to Diane Aldridge and working with patients with MND and their families.
Hello, my name is Diane Aldridge. I work as a social worker at the Greater Manchester MND Care Centre, based at Salford Royal Foundation Trust, which is a hospital in the north of England in the UK. Today, I'd like to talk to you about working with people with motor neuron disease and their families, and to share some lessons from practice. In 2017, the MND Association funded a family support worker post for 4 years at the Greater Manchester MND Care Centre. It was a new post to look at not only the needs of the person with motor neuron disease, but their wider family and any children that they might have. A group of existing patients were identified, and I also saw newly diagnosed patients as they came into our clinic. When I met somebody with motor neuron disease, I would talk to them about how the condition was impacting on their lives. For example, on their ability to manage their personal care, activities of daily living, maintaining relationships, accessing the community, work or training, issues with the home environment, or any caring responsibilities that it may have for a child. The images shown are taken with thanks from the MND Association, their new animation called What is Social Care? In social care, we're encouraged to take a think family approach, to consider the family to the person in their wider context. I would like to encourage you all today, whatever your role, to consider asking these questions when you meet somebody with motor neuron disease. When we ask, who helps with your support? This can identify young carers or support from neighbours or friends. It also helps us to avoid assumptions. For example, I was working with a couple who had 3 young children. I went to visit the gentleman and his wife on a couple of occasions. And whilst his wife never joined us when I met with him, I always assumed that she provided support. It was only having gotten to know him a bit better and building trust and being a bit more inquisitive did I find out that it was in fact his 10-year-old son who was helping him with personal care, help feed him and help with his medication. When we ask somebody, do they provide any support or care for somebody else? It acknowledges that people with motor neuron disease care for and care about others. I met a 70-year-old gentleman in clinic. He'd been newly diagnosed with motor neuron disease. He wasn't worried about how it would impact on himself. He said to me, my dad's 94, he's blind. I visit him twice a week. How will I carry on doing that? When we ask the question, is there a child in the family? It helps us to acknowledge the way that families are made up differently today. For example, I worked with a man who was divorced from his wife and he didn't see his own 12-year-old son, but his 17-year-old stepdaughter was providing him with care and support. I also worked with an older couple who had taken on the parental responsibility for their 2 grandsons because their own son had an acquired brain injury. I also use an approach, when necessary, called Together, Apart, Together, which allows us to gain the perspectives of different individuals involved. In this example, I worked with a couple who had 2 young children. Both of them were still working. The gentleman with motor neuron disease said to me that he didn't feel he needed my support as he was well supported by his community neuro rehab team and his association visitor. He did, however, say that he felt his wife would benefit from my support because she needed counselling. She was always stressed and tearful. When I met with her a couple of times on her own, she was able to explain to me that it wasn't counselling that she wanted, and what she found most stressful was the morning routine. She had to get her husband ready for work, herself ready for work, and the 2 children ready for school and nursery. She found this incredibly stressful. With this information, I was able to go back with her to her husband, and we talked about this. He then agreed, admittedly reluctantly, to be referred to adult social care services for a care assessment. This resulted in him having care just 3 mornings a week on the days that he had to go into the office. This helped his wife immensely. She didn't want to talk necessarily about the emotional side of motor neuron disease, but she did admit that she'd like to know more information about how the disease might progress in the future. With this information, I was able to talk to the specialist MND nurses at the care centre, who agreed that on his next appointment, they would spend some time with her separately to talk to her and answer any questions that she had about motor neuron disease in general. The MND specialist nurses at the care centre also offer the carers of newly diagnosed patients the opportunity to talk about their needs separately using the CESNAT, which is the Carers Needs Assessment Tool. Now like to talk about some times when I think we should all take the time to stop and to think family, such as when somebody is newly diagnosed with motor neuron disease. They may be worried about what to tell their children, when to tell their children, or even if to tell their children about their diagnosis. Some of the reasons why they may not tell their children is because they don't want to worry them, or they say, I don't want to make them sad. Or the patient themselves don't want to think too far ahead about their diagnosis, preferring to take each day as it comes. Perhaps the downside of this approach may be that for young children, no matter what age they are, can sense maybe when something is wrong or changes are afoot. And in the absence of information, their imagination can fill in the gaps. They may also feel anxious or worried, but not know who to talk to. In these times, I think it's very important that we think, do parents and families have the information that they need to think about these issues? I could recommend the information that I've shown on the screen in terms of that provided by the MND Association, or for example, Winston's Wish. Before we recommend any information to families, I would encourage us to read it ourselves. Do we like it? Is it useful? When we pass on information to parents or families, I would also encourage them to read that information before they pass it on to their children. I have found that when parents have the information they need or the support that they need to think about these issues, they are better prepared and able to make informed decisions about whether to tell their children. They're also more prepared so that when their children ask questions, they can answer them. Children ask questions when you least expect it, sometimes when you're travelling in the back of the car. I'm sure that all of us, in working with those with motor neuron disease, try to help them maintain and improve their quality of life. As a social worker working with people with motor neuron disease, I would perhaps look at some of the following areas. For example, maximising their income, referring them to welfare rights advice, helping them to apply for grants, both from the MND Association and also maybe other charities, sometimes linked to their occupation. I've encouraged families to apply for the grants from the MND Association. For example, I worked with one couple who was somewhat reluctant to apply. They were middle class and they felt that the money should go to other people. They didn't need it. I encouraged them to apply for a quality of life grant, and they used it to go back to the hotel where they spent their honeymoon. Only this time they brought their 8-year-old daughter and 10-year-old son with them, and they had a wonderful time, and I'm sure that they'll keep those memories forever. I also support people if it's important to them to continue to work and to drive. For example, in the UK, we have a government scheme called Access to Work. We can refer people to the driving assessment centres and also help them with mobility cars. I would also ask you to look at local resources in your area. Are there things that families can still do together and have fun? In Greater Manchester, in some of the local parks, they have a scheme called Wheels for All, which helps people, disabled people, cycle with their families. A speech and language therapist in our team told me about a charity called Special Effect, which helps people to continue using their computers and gaming stations. Another time that I'd like us all, when working with someone with MND, to stop and to think family is perhaps when their symptoms begin to change. This might be a time when more equipment is coming into the home or they're having to use downstairs living. At these times, it may become more apparent to children that things are changing, and we need to check out with them that they're still okay with this. For example, I was working with a grandmother who explained that she was using her NIV machine more in the afternoons. So I checked out with her. I said, "How's your grandson with that?" And she said, "Oh, he's fine. He calls it my Darth Vader mask." But this is an opportunity for us to point children in the direction of the information that we've got. Families don't have to read booklets from cover to cover. You can just highlight the specific symptom at that time. For example, in this case, breathing. I think now is a good time when we're working with somebody to talk to them about contingency planning, to just ask the simple questions. What would the kids do in an emergency? Or who looks after the kids in an emergency? One of the patients that I work with following my intervention said, "Thank you so much. It's given us the prompts to sort things out for the kids." I'd like us all, no matter what our role, to work with people with motor neuron disease, to encourage them and to help them build and to store memories. I've worked in partnership with the Children's and Young Persons Development Manager at the MND Association to pilot the memory boxes that you can see on screen. But also we can encourage families to make and decorate their own memory boxes however they see fit. The people that I've worked with have been very happy to talk about these things. For example, I've had one dad say, "I love cooking. I've written out a book of recipes to pass on to my daughter." Another gentleman was in the process of writing letters to his daughter for each of his upcoming birthdays. He was using his computer while he still could. So, for example, if you're a speech and language therapist talking to a patient about possible speech changes in the future, could you point them in the direction of apps such as Record Me Now? I'd just like to talk about and reiterate just how the simple things can mean so much when working with families. The first example is of a joint visit myself and the occupational therapist did, and we were able to make a joint bid for funding for an eater-eater. The second example is a family that I was working with who sometimes didn't attend outpatients appointments. The gentleman said, "We need to get back in time for the kids finishing school at 3 o'clock. I shared this information with the care team, and it was something as simple as changing his appointment to the first one in the afternoon at 1 o'clock, talking to the local branch of the MND Association, who kindly provided taxi fares so that the gentleman wasn't stuck on hospital transport waiting to get home. The third example is when I did a joint visit with one of the community physiotherapists. We sat and talked to him about his 3 children, and she just happened to spot the football under the chair, and she suggested, "Would you like some exercises that I could do with the kids?" We don't necessarily have to have all the answers and all the information. I found that the MND support services have been a wealth of information. For example, I didn't know where to hire a wheelchair accessible vehicle, but they did, and it's enabled a family to have a great holiday. Something that did take a little bit more time and planning, but was worth it, was in September last year, as a care centre with help from the MND Association and the Young Persons Development Manager, friends, volunteers, we organised a big family picnic at Heaton Park in Manchester. It was attended by 135 people of multi-generations. 35 children and young people took part in the treetop nets, and 30 young people enjoyed arts and crafts. It also brought families together who could share experiences, but most of all, just to have fun. So in my concluding remarks, I would just like to thank everyone that I've worked with who've shown a willingness to work collaboratively to improve the lives of those living with MND. And to ask you all, no matter what your role, is to ask some of the questions that I've mentioned today. You don't have to have the answers. It's just about asking the question. And if we all take a think family approach, a small change in our thinking can make such a big difference to those living with MND and their families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. That was an amazing presentation. I really liked how there was so much information in it, and it was put together so well. Thank you. It's so important to think about the families, and you thought about it at all different levels. I'm sure there's going to be questions. I am hearing some other comments about other people calling their breathing machines Darth Vader and other similar things. Somebody was asking about whether the application can like replay an emotional voice, or is it like the memory piece, or the memory box?
The memories. Yeah.
And we talked about the memory box idea, or coming up with memories for your family, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to be just, it was just a thought that people were talking about in general with the families. It doesn't have to be so focused like we're going to sit down and we're going to memorize everything. It can be, let's sit down with both parents and ask both of them, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite memory?
Yeah.
And that way it doesn't always make it so intense.
Definitely. I think it's just about encouraging us all to talk and share things with our families.
So there's a lot of people again saying thank you, and great advice on the emergency plans. And Marcela Santos from Colombia is asking for the memory box. How do you propose it as a helpful tool so it doesn't feel like the person is, getting close to death, just similar to what we talked about? How do you bring it up with the family?
I think it's just about having good experiences and keeping postcards, taking photographs, things just to do throughout somebody's journey.
And Nick Goldup from MNDA has put the link to the memory box in the chat. Again, most people are just saying thank you so much for the wonderful resources. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, just think family.
Just think family. All right, Rachel, do you have any? Are you seeing any other questions?
I can't see any, no other questions, but I would say until recently, we kind of, I think we didn't probably address the families, but actually the M&D Association have got a new scheme at the moment that they've linked up with Bernardo's, and they're now able to offer more help and support to the children, which is a fantastic thing, which we need to take and make good use of, I think.
Yeah.
So do you have, actually now I do have a question now you mentioned that. Do you have a form, like when you're talking to them first thing when you're first meeting them in the clinic, where you start right away then asking about the family?
Yeah. I think it's important to do that initially, and then get some more information about what school the children go to, who else looks after them, but just in a general way, just broadening out your initial contact with somebody to think about their wider family.
Right. And then what are they doing, and how are they helping out in the home that comes
Yeah,
on
yeah, and
later on.
yeah, and who's important to the person with MND? Do they look after anybody? You know.
All right. Well, again, everyone is just saying kudos and thank you so much. We all know how important it is to think about the family, but this is these are going to be very useful tools to everyone. And people have been asking about the slides and the presentations. So just so people know, the slides have been put in the chat box. The resources will be available on the site where you logged in. Under resources, you'll actually be able to see these presentations as well. Oh, there is one question, and we do have time for that. Do you have suggestions for how to encourage families to engage children at different developmental levels, whether it's preschool, school age, or teenagers? Like, so that focused?
I think my advice would be to get the correct information from whatever organisation, like the MND Association or Winston's Wish. They have different booklets and information, aimed at different ages of children. There's usually something for all ages.
Yes, and I loved your advice to read the material
Definitely.
before you hand them out to somebody.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
That was great advice. And I believe the MND Association has, encourages people from around the globe to use their resources on their website. All right. Well, then we are going to say thank you so much, Diane. This was a
Thank you.
presentation. Again, here's all the clapping that you don't hear in the room.